much, Rebecca, for joining this ECDPM conversation today for our magazine Great Insights. It's really an honor having you with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And you are now Director of Research, Data and Innovation at the World Resources Institute Africa. Before that, you were Chief of Research at Power for All, which is a coalition of more than 300 renewable energy practitioners working towards universal electricity access. We will surely talk more about that later, about fair access to electricity. But can you first tell us what exactly you are doing now at World Resources Institute? What are the objectives of your work?
So we work across, we sort of at the intersection of environment and development challenges in a couple of key thematic areas, from cities and urban development through to forests and restoration and rural landscapes, through to energy, climate, and economy. There are also some teams that work on oceans and so on. So as you can see, really capturing the breadth of challenges that we're facing as a global community today. And our work is really to explore the intersections between those areas and produce research and work with local governments, work with, specifically in Sub-Saharan Africa, work with Pan-African regional institutions, and also work with subnational actors to implement change as according to what research shows are the most sustainable ways to develop local economies.
Okay, great. Thank you. That's really important work that you're doing. Now, I'd like to talk about green transition and what it means on the ground in African countries. Of course, Africa is a huge continent and countries have very different priorities and very different needs. But so if we look at green transition through the lens of green technology, there is also a lot of talk about leapfrogging and strong interest we hear from African leaders in leapfrogging. Now, what in your view is needed to make this drive for a technology-driven transition benefit African development?
Remember that many economies here, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, outside of South Africa, are in early stages of industrialization and movement beyond primary commodity dependence. So energy consumption is still quite low. Electronic and other consumer wastes are still quite low. So when we talk about the green transition, it's less of a transition, meaning a conversion from state A to different state B, and more of a growth pattern that leverages, as you said, global technologies and economic drivers so that the continent is not locked in to all the technologies that might be stranded or difficult to finance in the future. So a couple of those drivers, as you're asking about global technology drivers, are, I would say there's five. There is diversification. So first and foremost, a diversification of revenue streams, sources of production, value chains in particular. Oftentimes we are the primary commodity providers, but growing up those value chains, extending up those value chains through trade relations and so on, are all critical diversifications to support African economies. Second is digitalization. So we're seeing the leveraging of a global shift to digital technologies that can improve the trading of goods and services and grow the reach of SMEs. So now they're who are the cornerstones really of African economy. So now you're seeing more of a drive towards digital platforms for engaging with customers and so on. And this has only been accelerated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Third, I would say, is decarbonization. So a shift towards low carbon technologies across African industries, especially as these technologies can now compete on a cost basis with their incumbents. Decentralization. So of course, energy is the pillar that underpins growth, and currently rates are very low. So more than half of the continent, more than 600 million people still do not have access to basic electricity services. So leveraging smart, digital, decentralized solutions is critical to ensure that both urban, peri-urban, rural, and far rural communities are able to participate in the trade of goods and services and the expansion of value chains across the continent. And then lastly, I would say democratization is sitting at the heart of this transition. And this is the idea that the green transition must be owned by and centered on Africa's people, especially its young people, who are the vast majority of the population, and who will be on the front lines of future climate change impacts and who are already on the front lines of deep economic insufficiencies, as we can see with the growing youth unemployment crisis. So that's what we mean by the green transition here, and those are the types of technological drivers that are really creating an enabling space for transition.
Okay, yeah, you're really raising pertinent points, but I would also like to talk a bit about trade-offs, because I believe that there cannot be green transition without trade-offs, be it social or economic negative consequences of a green transition. How do you see that?
I think that there really needs to be alignment between the rhetoric of green transition and what that means in principle with actual regional, national, and subnational policies so that there is an alignment and an ability to achieve the ambition and sort of as a whole instead of piecemeal. So for instance, ensuring that the pursuit of green transition opens up more job creation opportunities than it closes down, or ensuring that the cross-border trade rules and such in this pursuit create more opportunities for SMEs and those that are most vulnerable to benefit, rather than entrenching a small crop of winners who are able to trade across the continent easily. We also have to ensure that even as low carbon technologies like electric vehicle markets take root, that these markets do not deepen African dependence on foreign products, but rather can create opportunities for local manufacturing and local industries. And then even as we're ensuring the staving off of future emissions, and that continues to be a North Star, we really have to ensure that this does not overshadow the grave need for adaptation and the grave need for adaptation finance. So those are some of the trade-offs that are being interrogated right now through our Pan-African institutions regionally, nationally, and subnationally to ensure that green transition and just transition are really hand in hand and not in competition with each other.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's really important to focus on the coherence of policies at all different levels, as you say. And do you think overall policies at these different scales, so African Union scale, regional, national, and so on, that they are being conducive for an effective green transition? There is, for example, the recent African Union Green Resilience and Recovery Action Plan, so the GRAP, that has been adopted. Do you think that this type of continental plan can lead to a successful green transition?
Well, I think from a technological point of view, the pieces are there. There is consensus now that the most important synergy in the global energy transition and Africa's transition is a combination of increasing the use of low-cost renewable power technologies and the wider adoption of electricity to power end-use applications, especially in transportation and heat. Now, while there is consensus from a technological point of view, I think where there is challenge and there may be incoherence amongst the policies is in the way that we progress to electrified and renewable systems. And what I mean here is really the structure of the systems that this transformation is taking place in. So for instance, as I mentioned before, with the drive towards electric vehicle markets, of course, these are technologies that offer more efficiency than internal combustion engine technologies of not even the past, but really what we're leveraging today. But are we ensuring that this is being done, or these fiscal policies to support electric mobility are being implemented in a way that are in line with sustainable visions for mobility more broadly, that prioritize, say, public and non-motorized transportation first and foremost? So that's one example of a question that we really need to ask in terms of the pathway towards sustainable energy transitions. Another consideration is that as we shift end use to electricity, the technology shift will lead to relocation of some industrial processes, right? For instance, shift from traditional carbon and energy intensive steel production methods to green steel production methods that leverage hydrogen. Those kinds of shifts will have global geopolitical and economic implications. So those are very important conversations for the African continent to be having, especially as the industrialization agenda just gets underway. A third example is the growing debate right now around natural gas. And while outright bans on all fossil fuels are a key policy position forwarded by many donors in the West, there are critical implications for emerging economies that, especially here in sub-Saharan Africa, such as the Middle East and North African region, that depend heavily on hydrocarbon revenues. We have to think about the vulnerable regions that are not responsible for, significant emissions contributions, but are in the early stages of developing local energy markets based on local resources, or that see LPG as a sustainable solution for increased access to clean cooking, or see CNG as sustainable solutions for transportation. So these are questions that I think, as you're saying, we have some policy in place, but we really need to dig down now into some of the more technical, sociocultural, and geopolitical considerations. A last one I will just speak to quickly because it's so important. I don't want to forget it, is finance and governance. So we must interrogate the very bodies that are invested with the power to convene and define the rules of the global game, where finance comes from, where it is allowed to flow, and ask whether there is equal and fair representation of views and perspectives, especially from Global South, and as we're talking about today, from Sub-Saharan Africa, as it pertains to what finance is needed and under what conditions. So all of that to say that there are complex technical, economic, sociocultural, geopolitical considerations that have to sit alongside our ideas of green in order to determine the most appropriate pathways of global transition, and specifically for Sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, technology will be a central part of the transition, but even as technology advances, it must be coupled with this deeper thinking and critical reflection of systems at a structural level to ensure the just part of the transition.
Okay. Yeah, the situation is extremely complex and will require very complex solutions also. But now, if we look at the local level, we see that in the global climate negotiations, the African Common Position has usually emphasized the importance of the need for access to clean energy, and you also mentioned that. Now, what are the main challenges in terms of access to renewable energy for communities in rural areas, but also in cities?
This one I could talk about truly all day, Hannah. There are many challenges that remain in the delivery of energy and clean energy to communities in order to facilitate this green transition that we're talking about. Let me start by saying that many African countries do now have electrification targets, even specified rural and urban electrification targets by 2030, and so on and so on. Many have rural electrification plans now. Some even have policies like off-grid regulations that help to streamline the growth of markets, especially where those markets are private sector led. So there is a lot of movement in the energy access space, but there are still many challenges that present barriers to the implementation of these plans. There's governance challenges, technical challenges, and economic and financial challenges. So those challenges range from the state and incentives of monopoly utilities in Africa, and what incentivizes them to reach communities that are not able to pay or will have a very low demand for their services. So that's one big challenge. And it ranges to challenges on reliability, on cost and quality of service. So there's a lot. Let me focus in on one major outstanding challenge that kind of relates to what you were talking about before, which is the availability of finance, both for companies and for consumers. So we know well what the level of finance that is required to meet universal energy access for countries in sub-Saharan Africa will look like. This is well documented by the IEA. You would have read the Africa Energy Outlook. Sustainable Energy for All publishes an annual series on this. The financial gap, though, is quite large. So for instance, the IEA estimates that over 150 billion USD per year would be required to achieve universal energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, which is over 2% of the continent's GDP. So for countries like the Congo, DRC, sorry, for countries like Ethiopia, for Nigeria, their need is actually entire orders of magnitude higher than the financing that is coming in. So this is a big part of the challenge, is external financing. So where are the multilateral development banks? Where are the major financiers? This is a challenge of risk perception and project costs. It's also a challenge of domestic finance. Where are the local banks? What incentive is there for local banks to engage on energy access when it's far easier and perhaps more lucrative to lend to government? There are challenges around project sizes. So many of these projects are not yet at scale, as we say in the sector. So the ticket sizes are quite small. There's also challenges around microfinance and how to deliver finance directly to farmers and businesses in rural communities in ways that do not burden them with future debt. And then the challenge is also in business models. So models that actually make economic and financial sense for partnership between utilities and decentralized energy providers to deliver access together faster and more reliably and more affordably to these communities. So many challenges, but I think, as you can see, finance remains one of the biggest ones to tackle if we are going to meet those targets for the SDGs, which is universal energy access, by 2030.
Right. So you have, exactly as you say, huge financial challenges for energy transition and for local electrification. But at the same time, there is also, you already mentioned, the adaptation finance gap. And that remains to be big, and that will be growing because, as also the recent result from the G7 has shown, it has been very difficult for countries to commit to additional climate finance targets. So then how do you see the future of mitigation on the one hand and also adaptation if the finance challenges will only grow?
Yes, I think this is you've framed it perfectly. Is that there is the access challenge and financing for access. There's financing for adaptation, financing for mitigation, and really the commitments, especially coming out of the G7, are not sufficient as overseas development assistance is decreasing, and as least developing countries, their debts are now being called upon. So there's a debt challenge as well here. And I think that challenge in particular, the debt challenge, is going to continue to grow as we have this unequal coming out of the COVID pandemic. You have some countries that are very quickly able to vaccinate and move on to economic recovery, and other countries, of course, will be left behind. Haiti in the Caribbean, where I'm from, hasn't received, I think, yet a single vaccine. And so that is then going to create more of a situation where we have, changes in interest rates and exchange rates, which will further deepen the debt crisis. So I think that we really need to address these challenges around finance and the mechanisms for distribution of finance and liquidity globally if we are going to be really matching up with the rhetoric of the international climate regimes and frameworks.
Yeah, what you're saying are also very important messages, I think, for the upcoming COP26. And that's really the focus of our magazine, Great Insights. So we are looking at what could and should be done in the run-up to the upcoming COP. So I want to ask you, besides what you were just saying, what is your other main message for COP26, and what are you hoping to see as a result?
Without sweeping action, by 2050, according to the latest research, Africa would be the world's most populous continent, number one, housing over 80% of its poor, number two, 90% of those left without basic energy access, number three, and its most climate vulnerable populations, number four, all while having contributed less than 5% of global carbon emissions. I say that because, framed in this way, African resilience and African energy transitions become an urgent global justice and equity challenge. So my message for COP is that this is a pivotal time for integrated and coordinated action. True sustainability will mean placing the most vulnerable, our local businesses, our smallholder farmers, our impoverished communities, at the core of a global development and global climate agenda. So we will need to see stronger commitments for emissions reductions. We will need to see stronger commitments for finance. And finally, we need embedded mechanisms for the realization of justice considerations. These are fundamental if international climate regimes are going to be successful.
And are you now very hopeful for COP26 that the result will be positive? Or what are your expectations?
I always try to stay hopeful, yes. I'm also looking forward to COP27, which will be here in sub-Saharan Africa. They say potentially it looks like it might be Egypt. And I'm hopeful that at that point, when we also have more attention on issues that are happening in continent, we'll be able to leverage that platform for change. So staying hopeful, yes.
Okay, great. Nice to end the conversation like that. And thank you very much for sharing your very insightful responses. We learned a lot, so thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.